Hello, fellow readers. Today I'm going to be reviewing Plato and the Tyrant by James Romm. This is a history book about Plato and his attempt to influence the politics of Syracuse. The cast of characters are Plato, whom I've already mentioned, the philosopher, Dionysius the elder, Dionysius the younger, and Dion, who was a family member and associate of Plato. Most of the story takes place in Syracuse, in Sicily, as well as in Athens, and as well as Corinth. Now, this is a book that I read, I say currently reading, but really I actually read it back in June and July in preparation for a trip that I took to Syracuse, actually to Sicily in general, and to Syracuse. And I sort of wanted to get a sort of historical kind of primer to Syracuse before I actually went and visited. As I said, the story centers around Plato and his attempt to influence politics in Syracuse. And at the time, Plato was interested in a concept that is actually quite famous in sort of historical and philosophical circles, which is the concept of the philosopher king. So he wrote a book called The Republic. So this is a Loeb copy of The Republic. So The Republic is considered to be one of Plato's masterpieces. It's also a late period book. And Plato, The Republic centers around this idea of the sort of perfect sort of ruler and how to rule a city. Now, Syracuse is sort of interesting in this period because generally in Greece and especially in Athens, where Plato is from and where he lived, Athens didn't believe in strongman rule. It believed in what we think of as a democracy, and is often referred to as a pure democracy. Of course, pure isn't really the right term when you think about it, because you did have disenfranchised people, essentially women and slaves, who could not vote. But the notion is that you have direct voting power at assembly. And this is the world that Plato lived in. Now, Plato, like many philosophers of the time, wasn't really a believer in demokratia or democracy. He sort of had this belief that not everyone was equipped to be involved in democracy. Not everyone really was equipped to have a vote. And he believed actually in what we sort of think of as a very undemocratic idea, which is he believed in this sort of philosopher king or philosopher ruler. Now, the notion of king was something that was anathema to Athenian politics and society in general. But there's a tendency to forget that Athens during this period was actually sort of unique in that it was one of the few places in the Greek world and the Mediterranean world at large that didn't have a king or a strong man ruling it. And an example of this is Syracuse. Another one is actually Sparta, but I'll get into Sparta in another episode. So Syracuse was ruled by a strong man, by a singular ruler, and who was a king in all intents and purposes, and was an absolute ruler, and attempted to establish a hereditary kingship at Syracuse. He was also famous for what is referred to as the Syracusan tables. So essentially a very sort of decadent lifestyle. Now, this is very interesting because Athens, for instance, itself was considered to be decadent. It was considered to be decadent by the Spartans. It was one of the things that sort of one of the many sort of differences in culture that Sparta had with Athens. Athens was erudite. It was a place of philosophy. It was a place of literature, of theater. And it was considered to be decadent and effeminate by the Spartans, who were the opposite of all of that. But interestingly, Syracuse was considered to be even more decadent. At any rate, during this period of time, Plato was put in contact with Dionysius, and he sort of attempted to communicate with Dionysius about this philosopher king. Dionysius actually hired Plato to come to Syracuse and to be the sort of court philosopher, almost how you might think of like if a company hired an ethicist, for instance, to sort of advise on ethical issues regarding business. In many ways, that's what Dionysius was attempting to do with Plato, and also hire Plato to essentially be the tutor to his son, also named Dionysius. Now, we've seen this elsewhere. For instance, Aristotle was a tutor to Alexander, and so this wasn't something that was unique. Oftentimes, some of these philosophers who were famous by this point in their lives became tutors to the sons of very, very powerful men. At any rate, so Plato goes to Syracuse and he encounters this sort of very decadent court. This court that is the Syracusan tables. It's about these huge meals and drinking and sort of flaunting power. And Plato had a really tough time of it. He ended up getting into a lot of trouble. He was actually sold into slavery. Now this is kind of crazy when you think about it, because this was a person who was already quite famous at this time. And essentially his life was in danger. And he was so unsuccessful that he ended up being sold into slavery. So he's back at Athens and he's writing this book, The Republic. While he's also doing this, he's writing letters as well. And so part of the book actually goes into analysis of some of these letters. So there's a number of letters that are attributed to Plato. A lot of them are actually considered to be fakes, but there's 5 which James Rom actually argues are, he believes, authentic letters. And this is something I didn't know really beforehand. Plato is someone that I've studied both as an ancient historian, as well as I've studied him in ancient Greek courses. You read Plato, but you're usually reading his philosophical work. But he's written a number of letters, or there are a number of letters attributed to him, and some of them are quite personable, very direct. You get a sense of his personality. And also, one of the unique things about these letters is that Plato himself is a character. And now, why this is interesting? Well, one of the reasons this is interesting is because if you read The Republic, or you read any other sort of philosophical treatise by Plato, he's not writing about himself. He's not a figure in his books. In fact, Socrates is the main figure in his books. Or figures like Glaucon or Timaeus. So there's all these figures that are historical, that are mentioned in his works. But Plato himself doesn't appear. He doesn't appear in the Republic. He doesn't appear in the Apology. He doesn't appear in many, many other of his works. But he appears very explicitly in these letters. So they're very interesting for that purpose. And you see him sort of communicating with different people. He's writing letters to Dionysius. He's writing letters to Dion. He's writing letters essentially on the situation at Syracuse. And so what this means is that now Plato becomes a real person. And this is something that was really interesting for me in reading this book, because I never thought of Plato quite in this way. When you read Plato, you sort of forget that you're reading Plato and you think you're reading actually about Socrates. And of course, this is also interesting because Socrates never wrote anything down. Nothing has come down to us. Everything that we know about Socrates, we know because of Plato and also Xenophon. And so this book really brought this to light. So it's a very interesting read, and it sort of focuses on a very specific period of time. Now, is this a book that I would say is required reading? Well, that's a good question. And I sort of oscillate between required reading and recommended. I'm going to lean towards recommended. And the reason for that is because it's actually a wonderful book. So this is a great book. It's especially good if you don't know anything about Plato. But even if you do know something about him, like I do, it's still actually, you gain a lot. Because, for instance, like I said, for me, there are aspects of Plato that I didn't know about. I never spent any time reading his letters, his epistles. But I don't think I could say that it's required reading. And the reason for that is because I would say required reading would be this book. So this is The Republic by Plato. Now, this is the Penguin edition. It's actually very, very nice. Relatively modern translation that also has some essays in it, or a very nice introduction in which you're introduced to the text and you're introduced to Plato as an individual. Or you can read the Loeb edition if you're a scholar of ancient Greek, or you want to. It's a bit difficult to just enter this, but it's sort of kind of great to pick up a Loeb because you have the Greek on the left side and a very good translation on the right. I would say that this is required reading. Another great book is, of course, the Epistles. So I have the Loeb edition of the Epistles, which I would say is also required reading. And then actually another great book would be Plutarch's Lives. He has a Life of Dion. So this book actually has, and this particular Life of Dion actually has a lot of information about the fate of Dion. So Dion was, as I said, he was an antagonist. He was exiled. He then came back to Syracuse and actually took Syracuse over and expelled Dionysius the Younger. And a lot of this information appears in Plutarch's Dion. So I think those titles, I would say, are required reading. They would be on the syllabus. And recommended would be Plato and the Tyrant. I think this is an absolutely wonderful book. I highly recommend it. And it's very good if you are a person who, as I said, already knows a great deal about Plato. Is there stuff here that you may have not learned? And there's a bunch of stuff here that is, great for the beginner who's never read Plato before. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening. And we'll be back again next week with another episode of Currently Reading.